Citizen Blue Alpha 3177. It's time for you to demonstrate your application. Ah, yes, I see. Seems to be working. Wait, what is this? Ah, my terminal has crashed. What have you done? Explain yourself. What have you done to my system? What? What do you mean you don't have any answers? You don't know why I did it? It worked on my machine is not an excuse. You are sentenced to 30 days incarceration. Perhaps after that, you will learn how to properly program.
Hey, buddy. What you in here for? Oh, crashing the system. Yeah, that's not good. Really messed things up, did you? You don't know why? Yeah, did you check the logs? What do you mean you don't have any logs? You are a programmer, aren't you? Oh, wow. Well, you know what, buddy? I've done some programming myself. Maybe I can give you a few pointers. And you can avoid getting stuck in here. So maybe we should start from the beginning. You know, we all kind of start the same way when we're creating a new application. It doesn't really matter what the language is or the environment. You know, we need to throw in some logging for application. So we throw in some console commands or print commands to throw out some information, whether it be, entering function X or the value of Y is 255 or error caught, variable A is a null value or something like that. Things like that. And that's fine. That works for a little while, a very little while. But as your application grows, it's going to get very unwieldy. It's going to quickly outgrow that console logging. So from there, maybe we graduate onto some log files. We throw all that information instead of just printing it to the console. We'll throw it into a file. That'll be easy, right? One file at first, maybe moving on to files by date or files by run instance, and that's fine too for a little while. But what happens when we need to get at that log? Well, obviously if it's a server app and we're working in a best practices environment, as every citizen developer should do, we as developers shouldn't have access to that environment, so we have to get support involved or a DevOps team, and we have to go through that whole process of getting temporary access or getting them to pull a copy of the logs and sending it to us. Oh, but then there's the worst case. What if it's a client application that's installed on a client system? We don't have access to that at all. Then you've got somebody who sends you an email or gets you on the phone. You have to walk this person who doesn't know their keyboard from their left foot. We have to walk them through the process of finding that log file on their machine and then sending it to us. Maybe it's by email or Dropbox or some other method. And all that takes a lot of time and effort. And it delays our ability to respond to those production support requests when something goes very, very wrong. And, you don't end up in the slammer like me and like you right now. And on top of that, log files are just blobs of plain text. They're obtuse, they're wordy, they're difficult to parse. It can take forever to find what you're looking for and try to narrow that down when there's an error occurring, and to find out what the cause might be. And that's if we're lucky enough to have put in enough logging statements in the detail to capture what that root cause might be. Logging to files is always reactive in nature. We don't know to go look for an issue until somebody complains that something's gone wrong. And often by that time, it's way too late. So maybe we should take a step back, for a minute and say, what's the point? Why even do logging? Well, obviously, it won't get us, it keeps us from getting into trouble. But why do we really need application logging? Why do we need to have that in there? Well, first of all, there's troubleshooting. An effective log file will help us to easily and quickly pinpoint the source of an issue that our app is experiencing, so we don't bring down the whole system. And then there's general health monitoring. We not only log those information that'll help us pinpoint root causes of problems, but it can also give us an overall health view of our application at any given time. It'll tell us what errors are the most common and where our debugging efforts need to be focused first. We also have activity logging, that can tell us who's using the site, how often, what they're doing. And we know these days that's more important than anything. It'll tell us what parts of the application are working, and it also will tell us exactly what the users are actually using. So we're not spending hours and hours developing on a page that has no use and that nobody cares about. That tells us where to focus those new features and where to focus our enhancements. But with monitoring, we need to remember one rule. There's a difference between what people say they do and what people actually do. If we just rely on what they're saying, what they're telling us, we're going to miss out on what it is that they're actually doing. Plus, logging is proactive. If we have an effective logging solution in place, it can tell us in real time what pending issues are, and we can resolve them before they become actual issues. People love it when we fix the issues that they find, but what they love even more is not finding any issues at all. So, we've talked a little bit about the why, so let's delve a little bit into the effective logging strategies. What is it that's going to work for us? So let's start by talking about what kinds of things we should log. There's all kinds of things we might want to keep track of. It might be API calls, things, those would include details like the headers, IP addresses, parameters, form data, request bodies, response bodies, and the amount of time that it takes us to generate a response at all. That'll tell us how performant our application is and what kinds of things, where people are coming from. We can also log authentication. Whether it's successful, whether it's failed. It tells us how often people are using the system, who's using the system, and when there is that they're having problems. We can also talk about authorization as well as authentication. Are people trying to access things that they shouldn't have access to? And that'll tell us where we might need to focus some of our user interface cleanup. There's also other security auditing, keeping track of who did what and where and when, and where they did it from. Is somebody trying to access it from a place that they shouldn't be? We can track function calls, what those parameter values are, the execution time. It might tell us where we need to focus some of our efforts on improving the efficiency of our code. And of course, there's the errors and warnings. That's one of the primary things. Gather all the information that you can about them, including call stacks, function names, and whatnot. We track things like opt-in and opt-out. People say, I didn't sign up for that. Well, we'll have, by effective logging, we can have proof that, yeah, you did sign up for that. Data calls, keeping track of reads and writes to data sources, queries, again, parameters, filters, result counts, execution times, access to the databases, blob storage, file systems, whatever it might be. We can keep track of system stats like CPU performance, disk performance, memory usage. Yeah, there are other ways of keeping track of this, such as things that our cloud providers like Azure provide for us. But it can be hard to correlate that and collate that information. So if you can grab that from your application as well, all the better. And then there's system events, anything that might be going on that can affect your application. How do you know the difference between what it is that is being caused by your application and what's being caused by external events? Remediation. We can keep track of things that were self-corrected if your application is designed well enough, and what actions were taken to make that correction so that you can find ways to make it a little bit better in the future. And then, as with everything, you need to keep track of when something happened. So always make sure that you're keeping track of the timestamps, and always use UTC. What's UTC? The Universal Time Code? It just makes it easier than keeping track. By tracking things with UTC timestamps, it makes it far easier than trying to keep track of what the local times are and doing all those conversions. So we've talked about the things we might want to log, but if we log everything all the time, we're just going to clutter up our logs with a lot of useless data. And that can cost us quite literally. Data's cheap and CPU is cheap these days, but it's not free. And if we're unnecessarily logging everything all the time, that can add up quite quickly, not to mention be a big performance hit on our system. So that's where log levels come in. There are a number of industry standards out there which define log levels and what kinds of content we should be including in each one. But we can also define our own standard and our own levels if we want to. The standards typically fall into these categories. There's fatal and critical. Those are the worst of the worst, the extreme, most serious errors that bring down a system or cause your system to have catastrophic failures. Then there's just regular errors. These are things that cause some problems and cause some restrictions and impact, but don't bring down your system. There's warnings. Those are events that are less destructive than errors. They don't usually result in any reduction of the program's functionality or its full failure. They are, however, red signs that must be investigated and fixed over time. There's info level, just kind of keeping track of general information. Major events, informational messages. Then there's debugging. This denotes particular and detailed data, which is, mostly useful to us programmers. These are the logs that will assist us in debugging the code if we have serious issues and things that we want to keep track of. And then there's the trace level, which is tracking absolutely everything from the top to the bottom. And of course, with each information level, there's a certain amount of information that comes with it. With trace, as I mentioned, trace level tracking absolutely everything, and fatal and critical tracking only most of the worst of the worst. Setting up your log levels is critical and important to keeping your logs clean and keeping them in good shape, as also making sure that it's not providing too much of a hit of performance on your system. So make sure you're establishing policies on what kind of information and events belong on which log level and when they should be logged. Make discussions about logging a regular part of your code review. If you're using the standard levels, we'll typically want to keep the error level at error or warning for the full time, and then only turn on higher levels like info, debug, and trace when we have something that we need to keep track of or delve into even deeper. And always make sure that when we turn that on, it's only for a short period of time, because as I said, it tracks absolutely everything at the higher levels, and that can have a huge impact on your performance. There are also other levels that we might want to interject there. Maybe we want to insert something in between info and warning that tracks user information, like logons, logoffs, keeping track of what users are doing, where they're going in the system, just to keep track of that user activity. There's also while we're talking about users, is an important piece of information that we need to keep track of here. Any user data that can be specifically tied to a particular user needs to be carefully identified as such when we store it. As part of being compliant with the various laws across the world, such as the EU's GDPR, we have to allow users the option to download and delete any of that user-specific data that we keep and track about them. How you can track that can vary, and you can set it up however you want. You might want to have a specific data source for just that information. It might make it easier for you to keep track of and to be able to pull together that user-specific information, because part of those laws require that they be given the opportunity to delete that information if they should choose. And by keeping that information separate from all the other logging, it makes it a lot easier for you to take care of that when the time comes. There are other laws also that require that you keep track of specific information about the users in that country to be stored in that country. That includes logging data. So your logging system might need to be spread across multiple data centers to account for that. We also need to make sure that we're properly handling sensitive data and PII information, that personally identifiable information. You need to make sure that your logging handles of sensitive data such as birth dates, bank account records, credit cards, addresses, and so forth appropriately. You need to establish a combination of standards and tools to either prevent the logging of sensitive data, or if you determine that it needs to be logged, that it gets stored securely, encrypted, and hidden. Certain data such as passwords and encryption keys should never, ever be logged for any reason whatsoever. Doesn't matter. You should never store that information. Any other sensitive data that you deem absolutely necessary, you need to make sure that it's encrypted and stored separately in a location that is heavily restricted, so that not just anybody can find it and get a hold of it. You should also put tools in place to regularly scan your logging data to look for that sensitive information that might be stored inappropriately. All that said, there's one thing even more important than having well-defined logging levels. And that's the ability to change that logging level on the fly without having to reboot or restart your application. In .NET, the de facto has long been to define the logging level in the web and the app config files. However, changing the value there typically requires that you restart the application for that to take effect. And of course, turning it off and turning it on again frequently has the ability to magically solve issues. But it also brings down your system for a little bit. So that's generally not the ideal solution. And plus, when you reboot things, you might lose information that's relevant to helping you solve an issue. So it's far better to be able to keep that setting in a way that can be changed and reset without having to restart your application so that you don't lose those unique conditions that you might be running into. You also need a way to tie your logging together. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, but one good idea is to use a process ID. I can best explain this by an example. Say a call comes into your API endpoint. Before doing anything else, you generate a GUID, or a globally unique ID, that you can use to keep track of the process as it flows through your application. And as it flows through, you pass that GUID along with each function call. That way you can easily tie all the related log entries together and track the whole process all the way back from the beginning to the end. Yeah, it's going to add some development overhead, but in the long run, it's going to save you a lot of effort when you're triaging and debugging issues. You should also define a standard early on of what your logging structure will be. Now, while you could stream it to a file system, searching and parsing are generally more difficult there. So I often recommend using a database or some kind of external system. It doesn't really matter if it's SQL or some form of NoSQL like DocumentDB. Use whatever you want, whatever you like. But a document-based system gives you a bit more flexibility on the structure. A DocumentDB system, that is. But if you're going to use SQL, you'll need to figure out that table structure. And at the very least, I would recommend some of the following fields, and I won't go through all these, but there are a lot of good things that you can keep track of. And the more that you can define early on, the easier it will be in the long run. And if you are going to use a DocumentDB format instead of a relational SQL table, make sure that you establish the standards for how common data elements are structured and named, so that it's consistent across all the logging entries, as much as absolutely possible. Again, to allow you to parse it more easily and better later on. Even if you're using a SQL data store, I would recommend that certain information such as parameters and output be stored in JSON format. Most SQL systems have full support for JSON these days and make it a lot easier to search the data later. That will make it a lot easier to search that data later on. But make sure that whatever data source you're using is set to support Unicode characters and not just ASCII. I can't tell you how many times over the years that issue has been that Unicode characters being fed into a system that was designed to support only ASCII characters. It's one of those issues that developers in the US don't think about enough, especially. So make sure that whatever you're doing, you're supporting the full Unicode character set throughout your application, not just in your logging, but throughout your entire application. And then there's that question, how much should I log? Well, you should always log the unexpected. But that question again, if my code appropriately expects and handles a certain type of error, should I still log it? If I have that information in there, or I have that specific exception type in there, do I need to log that information if my application is handling it well? Well, most of the time I'd say probably not, but there will be times when it's useful to capture that error. So maybe you might want to define an additional error logging level that will track captured error, or will track handled errors as well as unexpected errors. There will be times when an error can be expected and planned for. For example, maybe you have a file import and one random file in 10 is empty, and that's all right. So, you have that exception handling in there to track or to capture that file was empty error, and you handle it in your code, and you don't care about that. So that's something that you don't need to log really. But there may be times when you're not expecting an empty file to be empty. So you want to have that additional logging level in there, so that's something that if the issue keeps recurring, it might be something that would be useful for you to track. And proper error, exception handling doesn't necessarily mean that something in your code is broken. Exception handling can be quite useful in handling those kinds of expected errors and expected issues. If it's doing the right thing, and this is an error that you aren't ever going to be doing something to correct, then I would generally say, again, there's no real need to log that. Or at the very least, don't log it as an error. Perhaps you could create something at the info level instead of creating that special exception level. Log it as an informational thing, and then just turn on the info level logging, and it'll start capturing that in your logs. The question you're going to be asking yourself over and over again is, am I logging too much? Yeah, you probably are, especially early on. But it's going to save your neck sometimes, and it's better to have too much logging and not need it than to have too little logging and not be able to solve the problems because of those missing details. So always err on the side of caution. You can always circle back later and tone it down a bit if you feel like you're really overdoing it. Make sure that whatever you are logging at the current level isn't duplicating what a lower level function is logging. So again, that's circling back to that, making sure that you define your standards early on as what's appropriate to be logged at each level. And when you're adding those logging functions, be aware of what it is that the functions at a higher level up in the stack are logging, and don't duplicate that information. If you've got something that's logging that a process was called, you don't want something lower down logging that as well. Logging the same thing over and over again. So pay attention to what your code is doing. Pay attention to especially what it's logging, and make sure that you're not duplicating that logic. Then we get to the point of cleanup and maintenance. Over time, your logs are going to build up. You're going to collect a whole bunch of data. So you need to have policies in place regarding how long that data is going to live, and set up processes to do regular cleanup. You'll probably want to establish different policies based on the type and the level of log data. Maybe error information you want to keep for longer, and informational and debug information you only want to keep for a little short amount of time. But also make sure that you're aware of any laws that might regulate how long data must live, and plan that accordingly. For instance, you might be required to keep auditing and user data for a certain number of years, but error data might only be needed for 1 year, and server stats might only be needed for 6 months. You might also want to establish a separate cold storage for older data that you need to be able to get at, but not frequently. Many cloud service providers offer those different tiers of data storage, and the cold data storage is much cheaper than the hot data storage. So plan again accordingly for maintenance that moves logging data around to the various storage levels, so that you're keeping your costs in control as well. One example might be, keeping your auditing data in the live stream for 12 months, and then moving it to a cold storage system for an additional 7 years in case it's needed for legal discovery or something like that. That keeps your system from being overloaded, and not having tons and megabytes and gigabytes and terabytes of unneeded data in your hot storage. Review your policies on a regular basis, and make sure that you are including your legal team in anything that you're doing as far as logging information, as they will help you keep yourself legal with the various laws of the countries that you're operating in. Most of all, ensure that whatever your logging store is is tested regularly, that's backed up, and that you're testing your backups. So many times, so many stories I've heard over the years, and things that I've experienced myself, where we had backups running regularly and they stored that information, but we went to retrieve those backups, the backups were corrupted or they didn't work. I'm sure we've all experienced or heard horror stories like that with those backups that weren't tested. For instance, there's one just a couple years ago at an employer I was working at, where they were hosting a bunch of client data and work tasks on an in-house server. One morning, they came in to find that server, the hard disk on that server had died. And while they were creating backups and they were actually testing those backups, guess where they were storing those backups? On the same hard drive as the server data. So when the hard disk died, all that data was lost and all the backups went with it. So, storing data or storing those backups is important, but make sure that you're putting those backups on a different location. That way you don't end up with years of client data gone in a cloud of smoke. A good backup strategy is one of the most important policies that you're ever going to implement and hope that you never need. For most coding languages that you're working with, there are more than a few logging frameworks out there that will help you use as a base for building your logging tooling. In the .NET world, we have several examples that are very common, such as nlog, log4net, Serolog, and so on. They all work in a fairly similar manner, and with a minimum amount of effort, they allow you to quickly set up logging to any number of destinations, such as files and databases. And even in the newest version of .NET Core, there's a lot of that logging that's built in, so you don't even need an external framework for a lot of stuff. But whatever framework you decide on, your logging process should never be so overwhelming that it bogs down your system. Log calls should always be fire and forget. They should never be synchronous. They should always be asynchronous. You never want your logging system to be the reason that your app comes crashing down, especially in a case where your logging data store goes down or something like that. If your logging calls are inline or even in a poorly implemented async await flow, it can quickly bring down your entire system. So make sure that your core logging process is independent of the system process. And there are various ways that you can approach that, but one good example might be that you have a process in-app which collects logging messages in memory, and then you have a separate process running in a separate thread that works to pull those messages off the in-memory queue and write them to your logging store. So in that way, it should have some fallback destination or some kind of alert system for times when that logging store goes down. Because sooner or later, that's going to happen. And you know it will. And many of those logging frameworks out there will handle that gracefully for you. But if you're creating your own logging framework from scratch, make sure that you're putting that as a primary consideration when you're designing and building that logging framework. Another good example from my past, I worked at a bank and I was working on database systems, and they had a central database server where every other database server was to send its logs to. And that, of course, as you might expect, at one point that logging database server went offline and there was no failover, there was no backup, and it brought down every other single application, every other database, because they couldn't write to that central server. And it brought down everything for a couple of hours until they could bring the other server back up. So make sure that you've got a good design in place that has failover, that has redundancies, that has an independent process for the logging, so that you're not bringing down your application just because you're logging. Are you starting to get the idea here? You're starting to see how important this logging is, how much it can save your neck? I hope you are. So, as an alternative to logging to a local file or a database, there's also third-party tools out there, third-party platforms which can be used to send your data to. Now, some of those will collect logs into their own systems, and others you can use to, just use to provide insights and analysis into the logs that you're already collecting on your own. And some provide both services. They can analyze the logs you're creating and keeping in your local systems, and also move those logs or collect those logs into their own systems for that purpose. Generally, you can collectively refer to all these as application performance monitoring tools. And there are a bunch of different ones out there from all kinds of different vendors. But a lot of these tools have a bunch of, the most important part of these, I should say, of these tools is that they provide you with ways to analyze at a high level and also in depth various details of your logs, both things of your current state of your application, as also being able to identify and track ongoing trends in your applications. I talked earlier about how important it is to be able to identify issues before they become a problem, and so that you can resolve them before your customers see the issue. These kinds of tools can help you analyze and identify those things before they become critical issues and before your users start to notice. So that brings us to the question of whether or not you should roll your own or use one of these third-party systems. And that's not really a question I can answer for you, buddy. You're going to have to figure that out on your own, do your own evaluations. There are plenty of absolutely brilliant third-party systems out there that you can just plug in, configure, and go. But there are downsides to those systems as well. And cost is not just one. Or cost rather is one of those issues, not just the cost to buy in, but the costs you might not think about, such as bandwidth issues, especially if they're hosting the logging data on their own servers. You have to send that information from your applications to them. And that can give you, that can cost you network bandwidth as well as the hosting, hosting costs. On the other hand, you have to balance that out with the cost of rolling your own system, both labor and resources. Another thing that you have to consider is if you're using a third-party system, you're making yourself dependent on them. What happens if they go out of business? What happens if their systems go down and they have an outage? What guarantees do they provide? What happens if if something happens and their system goes down? Do you have a fallback in place? Do you have a plan for that? There's also the question of security. Now, most of the those systems are generally always very secure, but it's one more point of access that you have to keep track of and to to audit and keep control of. Is their system more secure or less secure than rolling your own? Well, that's going to be up to your own evaluations. But whatever your eventual log storage and monitoring strategy is, there is one element that is critical. It should be separate from the application that it is monitoring. It doesn't do you any good to have a log monitoring system in place if that log monitoring system is part of the application that it's monitoring. If your application goes down, so does your log monitoring tool. So keep them separate, whether you roll your own or whether you invest in a third party. And of course, there's reporting. Whether you're rolling your own again or using a third party tool, you're going to need reports. Lots and lots of reports. Reports, dashboards, and more reports. And they should be updating as near to real time as you can get. Even better if you can add alerts to those dashboards that will draw attention when certain parameters and thresholds have been crossed. Is CPU running out of resources? Is your hard drive space running out? Things like that to keep track of and keep aware of, and have those alerts in place to let you know. Is performance suddenly starting to drop off? Is if a call usually takes 300 milliseconds and suddenly it's taking 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds to respond, that's something you need to be alerted of as quickly as possible so that you can start trying to figure out where those issues are. And this is one area where third-party tools really excel. Many of them have tons and tons of reports and monitoring and alerts out of the box that are ready to go with the absolute minimum of setup. Whereas again, if you're rolling your own, you're going to have to create each of those reports, create each of those alerts, figure out how to create all those and how to keep track of all that information that you want to keep track of. And dashboards are great, but they only get you so far. At some point, you're going to need to dig into your log data and track down what the root cause of an issue is. Many of these tools have various means of doing that, via queries of various kinds. You can see a couple of examples here from Azure's Application Insights, which provides you a language that's very similar to SQL, T-SQL. They call it KQL. But you can use that to write queries into the various Application Insights data so that you can delve into your logging information. If you're deep into the Azure-based world, this is a key language that you're going to want to delve into and learn, so that you can start delving into your logs and be able to find the information that you're looking for. But whether it's a third-party tool or whether you roll your own, you're going to want to have some kind of plan and some kind of interface that will let you do some really deep searching. I would hesitate to just have people use something like SQL Server Management Studio to query your database tables. Simply due to, there's the security implications, of course. So again, you're going to have give access to your production log systems to your developers. So there's security implications there by giving people access to those logs. But we've all, been there when somebody accidentally deleted something in production that they shouldn't have. So giving people that access to information through SSMS can be a dangerous thing. So you want, whatever it is, you're going to want to make sure that you have some very strict security protocols in place to keep that access read-only, to keep that access secure. So whether it's a tool that you roll yourself, or whatever it is that the third-party provider gives to you, make sure that you have something in place to keep that information protected. But also make it very easily searchable for those times that you need to go and delve into that searching. And then, of course, one question is, should I have one central logging system or a different system for each application? And that's a very good question. Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. It's up to you, buddy. There's really not an answer that I can give you. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. By having a central log system, that can be great for monitoring at high levels. But what happens when your one central system to log them all goes down? Again, at best, you don't know what's happening in any of your systems. And at worst, if you've designed things badly, you can bring the whole company network down. So what I generally would recommend, if you can put the effort into it, is a tiered approach. Each application should have its own independent log monitoring system. And then you can have a central system that collects the logs from all those various log monitoring tools into a central repository, so that you can have a company-wide monitoring and reporting system, kind of like a data warehouse setup, but just specifically for your logs. Or even better, use an actual data warehouse system for that central system, so that each of your logging and monitoring tools is sending their information to that data warehouse that you can run those central reports off of. Then you just throw up some Power BI dashboards and call it a day. Something of that nature. When it comes down to it, we come back to the question, why should I care? Well, aside from you and your current situation, in general, effectively planning out logging takes time and effort, and it adds time to your development effort. And sure, most operating systems and web server platforms have some kind of built-in logging, but when it comes down to it, what comes out of the box is minimal, at best. It doesn't know your application. It doesn't know your needs. It doesn't know what you need to keep track of. And most of the time, it doesn't provide the kind of detail that you really need to tell you the true cause of the problem. By taking the time to plan out and effectively implement a proper application logging strategy, you'll save yourself hours and hours of troubleshooting effort when the problems arise. And they will happen. You know it and I know it. You've already experienced it. Your application's going to go down. It's going to crash. And you can't solve the problem quickly. If you can't solve the problem quickly, that is, you're going to lose customers. You're going to lose money. And you might lose your job. When businesses lose money, they cut costs. And when those cost cuts come, it's the IT staff that goes out the door first. So whether you're rolling your own or using a third-party tool, you need to make sure that you have a logging strategy in place that it's implemented and that you're keeping it in place, or keeping it in track. So that's all I can tell you, buddy. Might learn a thing or two, might be able to improve your day and have a better life. I hope it does. Me? Well, this is me. You can learn a little bit about me. You can go check out my site and find out some more information about me here and there. Maybe even send me a message. Tell me you found something useful. I'd appreciate it. And I thank you, and I hope you have a good day. And get out of here soon, will you?